The 2022 Oscar ceremony was a complete travesty.
Oh, wow!
I know I'm a bit late on that revelation, but among the many, many atrocities that came from that ceremony and made headlines was this.
And the Oscar goes to... Encanto!
No, not the fact that Encanto won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature, although, yeah, that is a pretty big travesty in and of itself. I'm talking about the moments preceding the announcement when these three Disney shills introduced the category as basically a playground for children and nobody else.
I see some parents out there know exactly what we're talking about.
These remarks sparked some much-deserved backlash online from both industry professionals and fans who decried these incredibly stupid insinuations of the age-old stereotype that animation is just a distraction for kids rather than a legitimate art form.
Animation is not a genre for kids, it's a medium.
Much like documentary filmmaking, animation in cinema seems to have been pigeonholed into its own little ghetto, where it's perceived as less than the more common forms of live-action storytelling. And while, yes, animation has become the default medium for popular kids programming, to completely ignore the vast levels of experimentation and creativity that animation invites would be about as fair as disparaging non-fiction books for being less than novels. To illustrate this point, I think it might be worthwhile to dive into the versatility of animation as a film practice, exploring just a few of the many different approaches we've seen and precisely what effects they can have on the stories being told. This is Animation as Experimentation. And before we get started, I can almost see, as a tragic piece of irony, YouTube flagging this video as being for kids just because there's an animated character in the thumbnail. So let me be clear. Right now, YouTube, this video is not for fucking kids.
You got that?
Great, let's get started. Before diving into some of the more overtly experimental styles of animation and film, I think it's important to take a brief moment to justify the very styles of modern animation that most people tend to think of as kids' movies. 3D animation is relatively recent in the history of film, but since Toy Story was released in 1995, it quickly became the default style for studios big and small. While there are still those studios dedicating themselves to the practice of hand-drawn or stop-motion animation, most studios involved in the medium have developed their entire empires off the back of 3D animation. But what's important to note is that, even when this style may come across as cheap or lazy, it too was developed as a result of experimenting with the medium. Given the vast landscape of hand-drawn animated films in the mid-90s, Toy Story, like all innovative art pieces, could very well have been considered an experiment in filmmaking at the time. It just so happened that this experiment was one that caught on to the point where it no longer felt like an experiment. Still, it would be a shame to neglect all the hard work that goes into crafting a detailed 3D animated film just because of its ubiquity. With each passing year, 3D animation from the likes of DreamWorks and Pixar and, yes, even Disney proper, has managed to advance the work that began when Steve Jobs acquired Pixar from Lucasfilm. Textures have been polished, motion has been tweaked, and lighting has been adjusted to create precise effects depending on the desired impacts of the films. So while, yes, 3D animation in itself is no longer considered an experimental style of filmmaking, that doesn't mean that there isn't constant innovation just waiting to be recognized. You'll find no shortage of people endlessly praising the field of stop-motion animation anytime Laika puts out a film. That isn't to say that the praise is unwarranted in any way, because obviously the process of animating in stop motion is a painstaking one that takes years and years of development just for a single project. More to that point, stop motion is usually a bigger gamble in today's age because, with the proliferation of smoother, shinier 3D films, the market for this kind of textured work is much smaller. So essentially, a stop motion film can, theoretically, take far more time to complete than its competition and, for all its trouble, earn far less in money and widespread recognition. Due to the more detailed nature and oftentimes darker subject matter of stop motion, you can argue that it's an inherently more adult-oriented style, but the catch-22 comes from the fact that adults, these days, tend to perceive animation as being for kids. So, these films become too alienating for children and too childish for adults who think themselves too cool to enjoy something made with dolls. The irony of these adults finding stop motion to be beneath them because it's animated is pretty apparent in the fact that part of the appeal of this style is that it's made with actual figurines filmed in front of an actual camera. This is about as close to live-action filmmaking as an animated film will get, and as a result, there's a real allure to watching these figurines move with as much fluidity as a real person, while still retaining that sort of textured edge that can only come from frame-by-frame manipulation. Okay, so you remember way back when I said stop motion was probably the closest animation could get to live action? That may not, strictly speaking, be true, because there's also rotoscope animation, which comes from scenarios being filmed like any other live action film, only to have animation painted over the frames in post. This is a style Richard Linklater has applied 3 times in the past in the films Waking Life, A Scanner Darkly, and Apollo 10½. You may be wondering, if these films are shot in live action, what's even the point of painting over them after the fact? When Linklater does this, the effect is generally to approximate a sort of parallel, sci-fi influenced world, where the reality on screen seems fairly close to the one we live in, but just different enough to make its more oblique visual and thematic ideas feel seamless. Could these films be produced without the layers of animation on top? Sure, but the animated camouflage helps to integrate the more outlandish and internalized visual ideas that may be too distracting with CGI, especially for films of such modest budget and scale. While 3D animation has become the standard for the field in today's age, it's easy to forget that hand-drawn animation was at the forefront of the field for decades. Before Disney made their full transition towards CGI, they were leading the way with pencil and paper. You might then want to argue that hand-drawn animation isn't exactly experimental, but even when this was the norm, there were still many ways one could go about animating a film depending on the desired mood. Fantastic Planet was made back in the 70s when pretty much all we saw was hand-drawn animation, but the film's particular blend of static backgrounds and choppy character movements gives it a sort of discomforting atmosphere that perfectly fits with its strange subject matter. Son of the White Mare is a completely stunning animated film that applies jaw-dropping 2D visuals and explosive colors to absorb you into this visualization of Hungarian legends. Then you have filmmakers like Martin Rosen, whose films Watership Down and The Plague Dogs integrate a sort of childlike storybook visual style that contrasts effectively with the hefty themes and occasional bursts of violence. Even today, when animators return to the 2D realm, they prefer to do so by innovating with the style. Films like Ernest and Celestine or Loving Vincent use watercolor and paint to echo the preferred artistic stylings of their characters, creating either a calming or ethereal atmosphere. Cartoon Saloon, the Irish animation house, have made a name for themselves thanks to their simple character designs set against detailed backdrops, sometimes even leaving backgrounds slightly unfinished to give their films a more personal touch. Then, in the complete opposite of detail, you have Don Hertzfeldt, whose films are entirely composed of simple stick figures and backgrounds. What may seem like the laziest style of all, Hertzfeldt's films actually benefit from their simplistic layouts because they allow the viewer to more easily insert themselves into what are often incredibly dark existential musings. Once more, it's the contrast between style and subject matter that makes the animation so intriguing. Animation as an art form receives far more respect in Japan, where not only do quote-unquote kids movies do well with adults, but the idea of using animation to tell overtly adult stories is far more accepted. While there is a certain visual style most commonly associated with anime, Japanese animation is as willing to experiment with visual techniques as its Western counterparts. The Tale of the Princess Kaguya and The Red Turtle utilize much simpler visual styles to allow audiences to connect with their more fantastical elements on a visceral level, while the films of Makoto Shinkai tend to utilize more photorealistic textures to achieve a similarly instinctive effect. In the West, animation in the mainstream tends to be seen as a cold, practical tool for large corporations. But in Japan, the emotional punch that comes from the pen and paper is not only acknowledged, but openly embraced. The main takeaway to be gathered from this video is that animation, as a medium, is under constant evolution, and the ability to connect with viewers on a more primal level isn't simply relegated to allowing them to see actual physical people on screen. On the contrary, one of the benefits of animation is its ability to visualize particular emotions and states of mind in ways that live action could never articulate. Animation is one of the most powerful storytelling tools out there, and to relegate it to mere child's play would be to do yourself and everyone around you a gross disservice. And yes, I realize I went this entire video without once mentioning Spider-Verse, but come on, did you really need me to tell you how amazing that film is? As always, thank you all for watching this video, and comment below with your own favorite styles of animation. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and look forward to the next video, which, if all goes as planned, will be a sort of companion piece to this one. Until then though, stay safe, and as always, I'll see you when I see ya.